we'll discuss in a minute, or in the discussion, there's a business purpose of why these captives were formed. And so any financial strategies that has tax implications, if you don't have a business purpose, then the strategy would be lacking. And that's one of the things that makes these programs very, very legitimate, the business purpose and also the black letter law supporting it. Brian, go ahead. Sorry.
Right, and I think that's a good point that Howard hits upon, and that's one, making sure that these risks that you put in here are ordinary and reasonable. We want to make sure that these coverages that we put into these captive programs, which again, a lot of folks are seeing some of the tax benefits, but the risk has to be legitimate. We can't cover hurricane coverage for somebody in the middle of Nebraska, and we can't charge high premiums for terrorism coverage for somebody who may not even leave the country. So again, they need to be reasonable and necessary coverages for them to be a deductible expense to the business. But the economic
or another way of saying it, under Code Section 162, these expenses are ordinary and necessary to the business, which really sums it up, if you will. Okay.
That's right. Now, and a couple more details here. So in simple terms, so what we're doing is we're going into the business, we're identifying coverages that are self-insured knowingly, but they're just on the balance sheet. And what these micro-captives do is they formalize those self-insured risk into a tax-deductible premium. They are funded into this C corporation, the captive. They're an expense to the business. And if losses are limited, whatever profit comes out is going to be taxed, again, at long-term capital gains or qualified dividend. So on the federal side, we roughly have about a 20% savings. And then what some folks are doing, and we can talk about this really more in an advanced setting, is having these captives potentially owned by certain types of trusts that may address certain tax issues as well. Now, a little bit more history on the section of the tax code, 831B. As I mentioned, it was created in the mid-'80s, and about 3,000 companies now make the 831B election by my best estimate. This isn't information that's easily gotten out there in terms of the number that have the election. Now, back in the mid-'80s, when this was created, this section of the tax code was created primarily for mutual insurance companies, not captives, as a way to provide crop insurance to carriers, provide crop insurance to farmers that couldn't purchase it because it was just commercially unavailable or just too expensive. So that's why this initially got created. And then in the 1990s, captives started to realize that they can take advantage of this section of the tax code. Some of the first companies that did this at the tail end of the 80s, but primarily the 90s, were auto dealerships. Auto dealerships started putting in their extended warranties through there as a profit center and made the 831B election. But there were probably only about 100 of these captives up until, when I say captives making the 831B election, up until about 2002. In 2002, the IRS came out with some safe harbors that detailed how these programs need to be structured. Before that time, it would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to go out and get the private letter rulings and to make sure that you are being treated as a captive or an insurance company for tax purposes. So when those safe harbors came out in 2002, which we'll talk about later, it really opened the floodgates, and that's why we have about 3,000 of these types of captives today. Now, there is some legislation out there. A lot of folks want to